Hi guys, I'm Chris,
And Mike.
and welcome back to this week's No Limits, a Mitch Rap podcast. What's new this week, Mike?
Hey, not much. Glad we got something a little bit different today on our author series. Had a really good chat. So that's about it for me. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Yeah, I did have one thing I wanted to ask you. Have you seen the Gray Man trailer?
I haven't. They released an official trailer?
No, it's not an official trailer. I forget what I was watching. Maybe it was during the Olympics.
Okay.
But Netflix had this like super hype video of all their 22 movies, and like the Gray Man. There was like a, I guess part of the teaser trailer was in there. Maybe 20 seconds of it.
I think I did see that then. I was watching something in the background. I was like, wait, was that Gray Man? And then it just flipped to something else. It was like a montage of different shows. Yeah.
That was it. Yeah.
Well, we talked about it before. Ryan Gosling, kind of like him. I look at him, I think, I don't know, not a rom-com, but I think of like Nicholas Sparks or something. I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to transition from seeing him in that role to seeing him as an action badass, but...
Yeah, but you've seen him in Drive. You've seen him in Place Beyond the Pines. Like,
he's got it. I haven't seen that second one, but yeah, he's got it. I don't know. I'll have to drop my biases and come with an open mind.
Yeah, it looks interesting. I hope they drop like an official trailer of it whenever it comes out, or closer to when it comes out. It was interesting to see him because he's also looking at the because like every single character in these movies like breaks the fourth wall, kind of like so. But yeah, the footage looks cool. It's like he's on a train in some European country. It looks like. So yeah, I'm kind of excited for that.
I forgot to look into it. I think they're going with the storyline of the first book, the original book. I haven't
read those yet. I really want to read them. I got the first one for Christmas. So
okay. Yeah, I've only read, I want to say 2 or 3. Definitely the first one, and I totally forgot what the other ones were. But if it's the storyline of the first book, that's pretty compelling. That's a good one to make into a movie. A lot of stuff goes down, I'll put it that way, and you very quickly establish that this guy's got skills.
Do you remember, is there a scene on a train in Europe or something?
I can't remember exactly. The most memorable scene is basically the culmination of the plot is an attack on a dwelling in the countryside. So that could definitely make sense. Right. That definitely makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, it didn't look like an American, Amtrak. It looked like a Eurostar. But speaking of TV shows, the other thing I wanted to bring up was, have you gotten a chance to check out Reacher?
No, but man, the internet is blowing up. Have you watched it?
Yeah, so I wasn't going to watch it right away, but then, so I listened to the Watch podcast. So it's on 2 of these guys I follow from The Ringer, and all they do is discuss TV. And I was so shocked when pretty much Mondays, they go 2 days a week, Mondays and Thursdays. Monday's pod was 90% about Reacher and just about how much they love it. And none of them had read the books at all. They don't know, but they did their research and they know that unlike Tom Cruise, this guy who's from like the teen, I remember I watched him with my dad watches that show Titans on HBO. And this guy's been a superhero. He was like Smallville's like Aquaman or something like that. This guy's huge.
Yeah.
And apparently they're doing it really true to the book. And it's really good.
People are going bananas for that show. And you don't often get an entire community of thriller fans united in saying this adaptation is well done to the books. You don't get that often. And almost everyone I've heard who's a Lee Child fan is over the moon about this series.
Yeah, and you could tell Lee Child's an executive producer on this. I didn't realize that's not his real name. That's a pen name. But yeah, no, Killing Floor was a really good book, and it gets just his physical presence. We haven't done anything about Reacher yet, but maybe we could do the Killing Floor, and the way he writes about Reacher and how he just has these imposing stares and he doesn't answer questions when he's asked. And apparently, I mean, and from what I've seen, so I'm like 3 episodes in, they get that. And from however they're shooting this thing, you just get the fact that this guy, is this immense presence that Tom Cruise did not convey.
Right.
And the other thing that's great about it is, this is Amazon, right? So they have all the money in the world. They could have done it where they, you have this amazing car chase and then there's boom, bang, bang, huge car crash.
The whiz bang.
But instead, it's actual just, all right, there's a car chase and then the guy pulls over, he gets out and he punches him in the face. Like, that's what's in the story, like, I don't know. For some reason, I feel like there's no reason why every single streamer can't do this to some series.
Right. This is going to be the catalyst. The momentum behind this series, it's a catalyst. I think it's going to crack open the thriller to screen adaptation to be done not in Hollywood's way, but in the author's way, or at least to value the author's voice and craft. I think it's a catalyst because, like we saw with American Assassin, Hollywood and the screenwriters and the production crews, they want to hijack the story. They don't want to tell the story the author wrote. They want to buy the rights to it, sell the name of the character, but tell you their own story visually and plot-wise. I'm getting good vibes from this, good vibes from Gray Man, good vibes from the Terminalist. That something's shifting, that these are the catalysts that are going to get this right and create momentum for more on-screen adaptations of thrillers.
You could see where in a world, any one of these three sort of, or, two of these three fail, then you never get something like this ever again.
Exactly.
But I think the opposite is going to happen. I agree with you that, Reacher's killing it. The Gray Man looks sick and people are saying it's going to be good. Terminalist, Jack Gar's been brought in. Again, he's an executive producer on this thing. Or I don't know if he's an official executive producer, but, he's
an advisor
being
at
involved.
Least.
Yeah. And, it's, it only gives one hope that they can do this for Midtrap. There's no reason why HBO can't have one of these. Or, Amazon. Amazon is a book company, at heart, like that, or not at heart, but like that's what they started out
Kindle,
as. And so it makes sense that they would. Apparently, the Wheel of Time series that came out last year, fans loved it. I'm sure there's like a sect. Sci-fi is like its own community, but the fans that I know that have read that, they actually enjoyed it. And they didn't try to make something that was for everybody. They made something for the fans, and with the idea that, all right, more people may come to this. I'm really hoping they kill it out of the park with Lord of the Rings. We'll see.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I think there's like $1 billion spent on that show yet already.
It's I believe, the most expensive streaming series ever made, if I'm not mistaken. I'm a little nervous. It seems they're doing the right things, but that's just a series that is really, really difficult to get right and really, really difficult to match what the films already have given to us. So, yeah. Chris, if Ted Lasso taught us anything, it's the hope that kills you. So I hope we're not going to have our dreams crushed here and Reacher's a one-off and everything else bombs. I don't think it's happening, but it's the hope that kills you, man.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, and the Harry Potter series is like ramping up, so
I don't want our expectations to be too high.
Someone needs to do a Midtrap series. Someone needs to do a Scott Harvath series.
Oh, I know.
We need redemption for that movie. That god-awful movie.
Like, the reader base of Vince Flynn is really great, and the ones who are in it are in it. We kind of attract new readers. People pass books to friends, family. You give somebody one book, they're going to buy the whole series if they actually read it. You can hook people. But the movie was an opportunity to reach such a wider audience. And it didn't do it. It didn't get there. So we need some redemption. You're right.
That movie was a success. We're probably not the ones here doing this podcast.
Yeah, good point. There would have been 18 of us, but they would have all been about the movie.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Anyways, that's. I just wanted to quick little aside here before we get to the meat of our episode. But yeah.
Well, the meat of our episode is getting here was a bit convoluted.
Oh, yes. Yes. Getting here was convoluted.
You want to tell the people what happened on our first 2 recordings of this interview?
Yeah, so the first time we sat down to record, we had some technical issues with getting our author's audio. And then so the second time, I couldn't be there, so Mike interviewed Chris by himself, and that's what you're going to hear. But Mike's mic just, I don't know, something happened to your mic, and luckily your computer picked up some recordings, so you have something to listen to. But
right.
I don't think that. Yes, we had a little audio difficulties, but the episode's a very good episode. You know, Chris is a great guy. I think you guys are going to really love this book. It's called A White Star in a Red Sky. Different concepts, some historical fiction. Highly recommend you guys going out, giving it a chance, giving it a try. So yeah.
All right, guys, today we do something a little bit different. We welcome on a special guest from a slightly different genre and different background than the thrillers we usually cover. Fantastic book, White Star in a Red Sky. So welcome, Chris Berman. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, great. I really enjoyed your book, and I don't often read historical fiction, but it was such a gripping narrative and a great time period in history. I got right into it, felt like I was reading a thriller with action on every page. Can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your book and where it came from?
Well, thank you very much. Actually, the book came from an idea I had when I was finishing up my master's degree in military history. To do my thesis on was women pilots of the USSR, because I was with a lot of people in the West. You're surprised to hear that during World War II, the Soviets had quite a number of women fighter pilots, bomber pilots, and also in other areas of the service, they had infantry snipers. They had tank commanders. So I did a lot of work on that, and I often thought to myself, gee, would it be interesting if one of our WAFs pilots are American women who flew aircraft in the Second World War as service pilots, where they would bring planes from the factories to staging areas for other pilots to pick up and fly into combat. Wouldn't it be interesting if one of them actually could fly into combat with their Soviet counterpart? And that's how the idea for the story began. And I can give you, without giving too much away about the story, I can just read to you the back cover, which everybody would see anyway if they got the book. It says, 2 young women flying for their countries will form a lasting bond of friendship forged in the crucible of war. Angela Moretti is a 19-year-old American WAFs ferry pilot, bringing Lend-Lease P-39 Air Cobra fighters to Alaska for Russian pilots to fly into battle. Angela lives with a terrible pain in her soul. Her kid brother has been executed by the Nazi SS. No one understands her thirst for revenge except Katya Leonova, a Red Air Force fighter pilot her own age, whose own family was murdered by the Nazis. Their shared tragedies will bring these 2 women together in friendship with a quirk of fate, sending them together into battle over Russia. Concealing Angela's true identity, the women will fight the Nazi invaders over Kursk in the greatest land and air battle in history, and learn through an unexpected ally that forgiveness triumphs over hate and revenge. So that's actually the meat of the story. And one of the things that I do as an author is, I will reach out to other authors for comments, blurbs, etc. And I don't know, are you familiar with the best-selling author Taylor Anderson?
No.
Taylor Anderson writes a series called The Destroyer Men, and it's an interesting series. It's a World War II series, but it's set on an alternate Earth. During a pitched battle in the Pacific, an American destroyer and a Japanese cruiser are sort of sucked through time space dimension and wind up on an Earth, but it's not this Earth. It's an alternate Earth with different sorts of creatures that had evolved into intelligence. And Taylor Anderson, I think he's got like 8 books, and I've read most of them. And he was really one of my favorite authors. And I sent him the manuscript, asked him would he comment on it. And Taylor Anderson wrote, Chris Berman's A White Star in a Red Sky checks all the important boxes and fires on all 12 cylinders of the Allison engine in Angela Moretti's too infrequently featured Bell P-39 Air Cobra. And Angela is not only likable, admirable, and with good motivations. Chris Berman creates just about the only believable scenario in which a strong-willed female American pilot could fly in desperate combat during one of the biggest, fiercest, and most pivotal battles in human history. Finally, I cared about what happened to Angela and those around her. I even cared about what happened to her plane. Taylor Anderson, New York Times best-selling author.
Wow, okay, that's an honor.
It's nice to get that.
Right. That's some great feedback, because Angela is such a memorable character in what she goes through and her dedication to the mission, to seeking justice and revenge for what the Nazis have done to her family, and the way she uses her skills as a pilot. I mean, I'm a history teacher. You know, World War II, we talk about Lend-Lease, but we don't have a personal story of how the supplies, the planes, the ships we were sending were used. Or we'd hear about women on the home front, Victory Gardens, and other ways they might have given back, but all domestic. Well, she actually takes a step forward and uses her piloting skills to get involved and to join up with the Soviets. And that's just fascinating to see that level of involvement from one of our women.
Yeah, and she is really surprised when Katya tells her. She says, "Oh, I'm a combat pilot with 6 victories," and she's like, "Really?"
Yeah, can you get into that as a military historian? How were the Soviets using women in combat roles, and why were they doing that? And what did that show about the difference in philosophy of how they were fighting the Eastern Front and we were helping on the Western Front?
This was an incredible, desperate situation for the Russians and, the whole Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. Those were the areas that were mostly affected and invaded by the Germans. They had amassed something like 3,000 aircraft, 2,500 tanks, 2.5 million men on the Soviet border in June of 1941. And on June 22nd at about 4 a.m, they came pouring across. First thing they did was completely devastate the Soviet Air Force. They took out something like 4,200 planes. Most of them were destroyed on the ground. The ones that got up were of inferior design, and they could not compete against the German, the Messerschmitt 109s at that time. Also, their combat tactics, Russian combat tactics for air combat, were very poorly thought out. They were still using the same tactics that pilots used in World War I. So it was a desperate situation, and they lost a lot of pilots and a lot of planes, but they were producing more and more aircraft east of the Urals, just churning them out of factories. And they needed more pilots. So it was Marina Roskova, who was a sort of a Russian Amelia Earhart. She was a well-decorated pilot, went to the leadership and she said, listen, we have thousands of women who have pilot's license, who can fly. I'd like to establish a regiment of fighter pilots, bomber pilots, and night bomber pilots. And it was agreed to, and thousands of women served. As a matter of fact, at the height of the war, there were something like 10 million Soviet troops. 8% of that were women. And they were not just in support roles, they were in combat roles. Particularly interesting were the ones known as the night witches. They would fly they're really, the Russians had a lot of these aircraft. They were called PO-2. They were a light twin-seat biplane, canvas and wood. But they would use them to bomb and harass German facilities and forces at night. They would fly in, cut their engines, glide over their target and drop their bombs, quickly turn around and go back to their bases and refuel and rearm. Those women were flying something like anywhere from 12 to 18 sorties a night. Some of them flew over 800 combat missions. The thing with the Red Air Force too was that unlike, well, you read about the American forces, like the bomber forces, the B-17s, they would rotate their pilots out after a certain number of missions. You know, if you were flying for the Red Air Force, you flew until the war was over or until you got killed. There was no rotating out.
Would you say those sorts of desperate measures, what the night witches were doing in these canvas, biplanes or two-seaters, even landing on these kerosene lamp lit runways, is that kind of the desperation and all-in effort that would turn the tide of a battle like Kursk? Was it a technical advantage? Was it a manpower advantage, just the number of bodies they had? What would you say is one of the main deciding factors there?
Well, the interesting thing about Kursk is that even a lot of the German high command said Hitler was making a big mistake to try to do this. The Germans had lost something like 250,000 men at Stalingrad. And 6 months later, Hitler says, I'm going to avenge Stalingrad. I'm going to cut off the Soviet armies at Kursk, because they had formed a bulge coming out into the areas that were being occupied by the Germans. So he put together, it was called Operation Citadel. And they brought in something like 1.25 million men. They brought in about 1,200 tanks, 2,500 aircraft. But the thing was that they brought in the types of equipment that didn't fare well in that environment. They rushed into production two particular fearsome tanks, the Tiger and the Panther tank. And both of them were excellent tanks, but they had real problems with reliability, mechanical breakdowns, short range with fuel. And meanwhile, the Soviets were pumping out these T-34 tanks, thousands and thousands of them. As a matter of fact, if you look at these statistics, during the war, the Germans built 1,600 Tiger I tanks. The Soviets built 55,000 T-34s. It was more of a question of they simply overwhelmed the Germans with their numbers. And at that time, those losses that the Germans were experiencing could not be recouped. It could not be made up. So it was like for every 2 aircraft the Germans would lose, they could replace it with 1. For every aircraft the Soviets would lose, they could replace it with 2 or 3. And the same thing was true with tanks. And the same thing was true with just bringing in millions of soldiers. And it was it was a question of just overwhelming them.
Right. And that's the deciding factor, the numbers.
And that wasn't even it. In the height of the battle, the American and British forces landed in Italy. And now all of a sudden, Germany is now facing a war from 2 fronts.
Right, they're split.
So on July 13th, Hitler issues an edict. He says, I'm canceling Operation Citadel, and I want you to withdraw your troops from there and support the forces in the West against the American and British that are coming through Italy. So at that point, you could say really at that point the war was over for Germany.
Yeah.
It was like they were badly wounded; they just wouldn't lay down and die.
What's amazing is all this detail that you obviously, have as a historian comes through in your book, and not in an overwhelming way. It seamlessly works into the narrative of how the tide is shifting and why our heroes are able to do what they can do in the sky. And it's really neat to read a book and learn all this history, but it's a fiction story. So you've done a lot of writing. How did you come to this point where you wanted to write a historical fiction book?
Well, I had written a lot of science fiction, and my science fiction was what they call hard science fiction, which is very technical, very detailed, based on plausible technology. And most of that was set in the near future. One of the books was actually, you'd almost call it like a more of a techno thriller. It was called Red Moon, about the Chinese trying to establish dominance over the Western nations in space by setting up a moon base, a secret moon base, with a special area on the far side of the moon where they could launch back to Earth orbit nuclear weapons and basically interdict anything coming up into orbit from any country. And they could dictate the economic terms of who gets access to space, who gets access to those resources, and who controls those resources.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of comments that said, you're really on the money with this. This really sounds like something the Chinese would want to do.
Yeah. It's not too much of science fiction. That's almost going to be current events I can see in a few years here, if not sooner.
Yeah, because I had a former NASA astronaut go through the manuscript with me, and he even wrote the foreword to the book, and he said you are absolutely on the money with this.
I wonder, we track on the podcast the thriller genre pretty closely, and we've noticed a lot of your standard terrorist plot lines take place in the Middle East, extremists, the Russian plot lines, trying to bring back the dominance of the Soviets in that era. I'm wondering where the Chinese are going to come into a lot of the thriller political genre writing, because that's a threat that I feel like is largely untapped or unwatched in some ways. I mean, just look at the South China Sea. I haven't really read too many fiction books dealing with naval dominance in that part of the world. And like you, space, that's not so much science fiction anymore. If we consider satellites.
The Chinese are making a real effort to put stuff down on the moon. They've put up a space station. They've designed their spacecraft to be mass produced, and those spacecraft could easily be militarized with weapon systems on them. So yeah, that's not too far out of the realm of possibility. Dale Brown, I don't know if you've read any of his stuff.
Yes.
Military fiction writer, wrote a book called, I think it was called On Fatal Ground, which is one where the Chinese strike against Taiwan, and they take out our base in Guam and take out an aircraft carrier group. And it's how an unprepared United States can fight back.
Right.
And that was a really good book. I like Dale Brown's stuff.
I feel like the one or two Dale Brown books I read had a lot to do with planes, as your book did. This is often about planes. Yeah. Yeah,
he's an Air Force guy.
Gotcha. Okay, I thought so. If I recall the couple that I read years back. Yeah, so because in the book, another really technical piece that you learn a lot from and that you obviously have the chops to get into is the tech specs of the different planes.
Oh, sure.
Where did that come from? Has that always been a passion of yours?
Well, I've always been kind of a plane geek. I'm really big on World War II aircraft and later aircraft too. But there were those particular planes, particularly the P-39, was a really, really interesting airplane because it was the first aircraft built in this country that sat on a tricycle landing gear. It had its engine behind the pilot, and that's because it was built around its weapon system. It carried a 37 millimeter cannon that fired through the nose. And it was a very pretty airplane. It was very, as a matter of fact, I have one here.
Okay. Wow, nice.
That's actually the plane. In writing the book, I made sure I built a model of the plane so I could understand how it looked from all aspects.
Wow.
So that aircraft had one flaw. It didn't have a second stage supercharger, which limited its combat effectiveness to altitudes below about 18,000 feet. Our pilots in the Pacific hated it because the Japanese Zeros could fly well above that, up 25,000 feet, and basically could dictate combat at those altitudes. But we sent 4,800 of them to the Soviets, and the Russian pilots loved those planes. Matter of fact, two of their top aces scored almost all of their kills flying American-made P-39s.
Okay.
They were rugged. Their 37 millimeter cannon could basically, one hit would destroy an enemy aircraft. They were fast. They were just as fast as the German Messerschmitts. They were maneuverable, and we built planes with good pilot protection, sealed fuel tanks, armor plate around the seating, and bulletproof glass, which the Soviet aircraft, they're just cranking them out. Their philosophy was overcome the enemy with numbers rather than with a high quality aircraft.
The technology.
Even Stalin was quoted saying, quantity has a quality all of its own.
Okay. A very Soviet way of thinking too.
Yeah, he also said one death is a tragedy, a million deaths are a
statistic. Yep, I've heard that one.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
I wonder though, because there's a couple of authors who are plane geeks like you, and actually the first author we had on our podcast was Ward Larson. He's a thriller writer. He writes the Assassin series. Highly recommend it. He was a pilot, or is a pilot himself. And so it's really cool to hear how he works that into all of his novels. And one of his more recent books introduced drones. So being a plane geek, what's your take on unmanned vehicles moving forward and drone technology? Are you happy that is possibly the wave of the future in aerospace, or is that something that kind of rubs you the wrong way?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it's going to be sort of an ancillary sort of weapon system to manned aircraft, because a lot of what you're looking at with unmanned drones with either AI or some sort of control system, there are ways to defeat that. There are ways to, everybody knows, a virus can get into your computer.
Yeah, cyber attack.
Something like that could be, it could actually be turned against, the side that's flying them, but an enemy could take control of them. Whereas that would be a lot more difficult to do with a human in the pilot seat.
That makes me think our hero, Mitch Rapp, in one of the more recent books, it's called Red War. And just to summarize the plot a bit, the Russian president, who is sort of an analog for Putin, is aging and gets a tumor diagnosis, and it basically ends up going off the deep end. And one of his more extremist generals convinces him to basically put troops on the border, which is something very relevant right now. But he amasses troops on the Belarusian border, the Ukrainian border. He actually goes so far as to take steps into the Baltic states. Again, fiction, right?
Yeah.
Fiction
now
writers.
The Baltics are NATO countries too.
Exactly. And the gamble he's taking there is, will the West stay true to Article 5? will the US, after something like Afghanistan, put up the troops legally? They're bound to, but the question he's playing
But
with
will
is
they
how
actually
far
do it?
how far will they push? Exactly. He actually goes so far as to have the Russians move into Latvia. And one thing that our hero Mitch Rapp on the ground and his partners are able to do is work with the Latvian defense forces, and they have a plan that when their whole grid is taken down, they use old infrastructure that they unearth, communications networks that are completely offline and still hardwired. And they have all these different mechanisms to still organize an evacuation and a defense, even offline, without modern technology. They call in actually the old operators to run the switchboards with the plugs and actually put people in touch. Do you think countries in Eastern Europe might be something to learn from, because the cyber attacks that we see going on recently to take down the power grids it's real life?
Yeah, I mean, you even look at the ending of the movie Independence Day. All of the satellite and communication systems are taken out. So how do you reach people? Use old school shortwave.
That's it. Yeah, I just really wondered if some states right now are considering backup plans that may require or rely upon old technology that people would dust it off, break it out, and that might be your only form of resistance.
Yeah, there was a short science fiction story that with small glitches in them, and they were able to introduce they became non-functional, and the side with like earlier generation weapons and aircraft and stuff was able to overcome them because their smart weapons had gotten too smart for their own good.
Right.
By the way, one of the things I also wanted to say, if getting back to A White Star in the Red Sky, some of those incidences in the book were actually happened. There's one thing I mentioned in there about how in one area of Ukraine, the SS rounded up a bunch of children and sent them running out in the field and used them as targets for target practice. And you'd read that and you say, oh, that couldn't have happened. Yeah, that happened under the command of SS General Richelieu.
Wow.
He says, he said, well, let's have some sport. Let's hunt some of these children. And the atrocities that went on were just absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah, sometimes the history is just way more shocking and disturbing what a twisted fiction writer could even come up with. And it happened. It really happened.
And the thing I was going to say too is I love doing the talks on the women pilots. I did talks like that for my daughter's high school, and they were really surprised that a lot of the they were the same age as the girls in the class. I said, yeah, you're 17, 18 years old. You would have been a pilot, a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot. And I was very fortunate to be to do a more formalized military lecture to the command people at Fort Bragg on the role of women in combat. That was a really, really special thing for me to go in there and go through all their security and stuff and be brought in and give this lecture to generals and colonels and all these people that were really high up into the military, and really they really appreciated the information. I was happy to do that. It wasn't long after that they opened up more opportunities for women in the military. So I think maybe I had some effect on that.
Hey, that's great. I wonder if that was around the time you hear of the first women passing, the Ranger training in the Army and different programs like that they were opening up.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I did this in I want to say it was 2016.
Yeah, it's so important because, again, from a history teacher's perspective, we always talk, the role of women on the home front, but there was so much more that they were doing in other countries that we could have learned from, we could have embraced quicker. And then even in the Vietnam era, we talk about conscription, and my kids are always shocked to hear, 21st century kids, what do you mean only boys had to sign up and put their name in the lottery and all this? And, other countries at that time were women, thousands of women fighter pilots. The Soviets have been doing that for a decade or two.
Yeah, the Israeli army has lots of women combatants.
Yeah, conscription there in Israel is all people. Is that right?
It's a mandatory thing that, at a certain age you go in and you serve.
Right.
And that's true. That's true now in Russia. It's also true in Ukraine.
Right.
Because I have my second family that's now, by marriage, my Ukrainian family, and half of them are Russian anyway. That's why the whole thing about Russia and Ukraine, it just boggles my mind, because my wife's father's Russian, her mother's Ukrainian. Most of the people we knew had, relatives that were Russian or Ukrainian, or they had people who were from Ukraine living in Russia. We had Russians living in Ukraine. And it's like, it's like crazy. It's like the United States deciding to invade Canada.
Right. It's wild. Yeah, I can only imagine what it's been like, since 2014 for your wife and her family. So in the book, though, you embrace that, I would say, with a lot of little cultural lessons. The language, you embrace a lot of Russian. And then for a point, I don't want to say how this happens, but our heroes, the two women, end up on the ground. They're kind of in the field in, what is that, Eastern Ukraine, right? Working with the villages, then the villagers on a ground force. That's where the book, I think, definitely felt a bit more like one of the espionage thrillers we're used to reading here on the podcast. The way that the villagers were working with them and concealing them. And I don't want to say too much more, but the last third of this book, after being, walloped with all these air battles and dogfights, it really shifts to a land battle and more of a behind the scenes kind of covert actions going through the countryside.
Yeah, and a quest for survival.
Yes. And the reliance on the community members for your survival.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to make sure, and I don't want to say too much about it, but in doing some of the research on the aircraft, is how badly a P-39 could be damaged and still be controllable. Things like that. It's interesting. I've often said this, like people like Tom Clancy, who wrote Hunt for Red October. Those writers who were writing pre-internet, when they did their technical research, boy, my hat is off to those people, because it's so much easier to do this. As a matter of fact, when I was writing the Das Bell book, there's a foot chase through part of Berlin, where one of the bad guys is trying to chase down this woman who he thinks is somebody else because she's wearing the other woman's coat. And so I go on to Google Earth, go to Google Street View in Berlin, and actually I can create the path that they took, and I could actually see the buildings and the streets where they would have been in order to write this part. And it was like, how would it have been possible to do that,
right.
25, 30 years ago?
You're the second or maybe even third author we talked to who said, we're talking about technology, right? And how it changes things, how Google Earth has helped writers. And some others have said it's almost bittersweet, because the ones who pre-COVID would have gotten to go to these places, or at least it would have been an excuse to take a vacation,
Yeah, or a tax credit.
Right. There you go. Tax deductible little trip right there.
Yeah.
Now, it's like, well, I could have just gone on Google Earth to find out where that bench was at the bus stop on the corner of the street in a foreign city. So, it's helpful. You can get more of that right. But, hopefully we'll go back to the times where you can experience that. And I guess, have you as a writer, it seems like your family connections, your military interests, how else have you kind of put your own personal stamp on the characters that you put in your books?
I tried to construct them. I read a lot of the biographies to the women combat pilots, the Russian women combat pilots, particularly Lydia Litviak. Katya in the story is kind of based on Lydia, although Lydia's story is really very tragic. She was an excellent combat ace, but she fell in love with her commanding officer, and he was killed right before her eyes. He was doing a low flying maneuver over their airfield, training a new pilot, and he was just a little too low, and he lost altitude. His wingtip caught the ground, and that was it. It was over. And nobody knows for certain what happened to her. The last she was seen she was flying into a cloud, fighting against 4 German 109s, and she never came back.
Wow. So that's incredible, that the lengths you go to read books on these characters just to shape probably a few paragraphs of backstory on the ones that you create, so that it really is realistic.
Yeah, I really think I did as much research on writing this fictional book as I would have done to write a nonfiction article or even a nonfiction book. I must have had, I must have had 6 books here on the Battle of Kursk. I had all my stuff from my military history courses. I have books here on aircraft with all their specifications. And of course, thanks to YouTube, I was able to actually watch training films of the P-39s, how they were flown, how they were maintained, what it was like to see one come in with a wheels-up landing. I watched air combat footage from gun cameras from aircraft, what it actually looked like in battle. And then, all of the dynamics, the maneuvers, the G-forces involved, how an aircraft could escape a pursuer, etc. So all of that is put into the book. And what was really nice about it is I actually had an Air Force combat pilot tell me, he said, "Wow," he says, "you nailed it. You got these maneuvers exactly right."
That must feel good. That must be like the validating factor that you can close the book and say, I did it.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things I do at the end of the book is I made sure that I give credit to a number of military historians in the acknowledgments. I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 military historians. Okay. Whose books I read and whose parts I incorporated into the stories, etc.
Well, Chris, all that hard work and research paid off with a great book. So glad you reached out so that I too could read it and enjoy it. And we hope our listeners do the same. A White Star in a Red Sky by Chris Berman.
Yeah, A White Star in a Red Sky can be found on Amazon, of course, and through Barnes & Noble and other venues. And it's available as an ebook, either as a Nook or as a Kindle. And it's also available in print. And I am very welcome for the support of readers who want to read the story and enjoy a good adventure along with learning some real World War II history.
Yes, indeed. Well, congrats on the book. And thanks for coming on the show. I really enjoyed the chit chat with Chris, my co-host. I don't always get to geek out and get into history as much as I'd like. So it was a pleasure to do it with you. Thanks for joining.
Okay, very cool. Thank you very much.
All right, guys, we hope you enjoyed that interview. Really nice talking to Chris. Glad he was able to come on twice to give the interview. So yeah, next week we have a pretty special episode for you. I'm excited for you guys to listen to this. We're going to be giving you the first lines. So it's a little concept. We'll go into a little bit more once you hear it, but just be on the lookout for that. We need to thank our patrons, our special operator, Sherry F., our special agents, Kevin, Daryl, George, Matt, Dawn, Dennis, Peggy, Catherine, Ray, Bridget, Jeff, and Mark. Man, it's getting longer and I like it. Please subscribe, rate, and review using your favorite podcasting platform. You can find us online at midtrappod.com or using Twitter and Insta at midtrappod. And as always, just let Mitch be Mitch. Just a disclaimer, this podcast is not affiliated with Vince Flynn, Kyle Mills, or Simon & Schuster, but thank you to them for bringing us the wonderful world of rap. And the music soundtrack is Guerrilla Tactics by Raphael Crux.